So we are AshaKiran. We're a 501 nonprofit, and our name actually translates to Ray of Hope in Hindi. We are lucky to have the founder of AshaKiran here, so I'm trying to make sure I get this all right. So we're a nonprofit providing crisis services. We provide these free culturally sensitive trainings that you guys are currently attending. We have a 24-hour Asha line, which is our crisis hotline. And our crisis hotline provides services in any language that a client could possibly need. We also have a safe home for survivors of domestic violence. And we do trainings to not just service providers, but also first responders and interpreters. So a lot of what we're doing today is focusing on the foreign born. So I want to go ahead and give a definition for what the foreign born is. So when I say that, what I mean is a person that wasn't born in the US or was not a citizen at birth. That is as simple as it is. So when we're talking about foreign born, it could be a naturalized citizen, which is a person that wasn't born in the US, but went through the process to become a citizen, which is often long, expensive, difficult. We're also talking about lawful permanent residents. So that can be a person that has like a green card. I think people are mostly familiar with that term. We're also talking about temporary immigrants. So this could be anyone who has a visa or international students. Refugees, so people who've come to this country to escape something going on in their home country. And undocumented immigrants. And if you don't recognize the term undocumented immigrants, we're referring to people that are sometimes called illegal immigrants, which is not a term we use because even if the thing they've done is illegal, as a person, that doesn't make them an illegal person. So we refer to them as undocumented immigrants. And if you have any questions while we're going through these slides, please feel free to ask your questions in the chat. I'm going to have it pulled up beside me. So I'm going to give you a little more information about the foreign born. The foreign born population in the US is larger than you might think. This is from 2019, so it's also probably grown since then. But the population is about 45 million. So this is around 14% of the US population. So that means when you're in a crowd of 100 people, 14 of those people are likely not born in the United States. Around 50% of those people are naturalized citizens, which, like I was talking about before, is a person that went through the process of becoming a citizen in the US. More than 4 million people have a green card that's been approved. And this is one of the bigger things we're going to talk about today, is that out of the population of people who are foreign born in the US, there are 49.7% of those people who only have a limited English proficiency. So limited English proficiency would mean that you might speak some English, you might not speak any English, you might speak enough English to get through your day, but that doesn't necessarily mean when you're in a crisis situation that you are going to be able to express yourself or fully understand everything, that you can handle all things in English. And I'm just going to answer a question in the chat. Somebody asked what the difference is between the terms naturalized citizen versus a lawful permanent resident. So a lawful permanent resident is someone who's been given permission to be in the country, but they're not necessarily going to have the full rights of a citizen. So they wouldn't be able to vote in elections. And I think that's honestly one of the major ones. I think other than that, it means that they're able to stay here, I believe, as long as they would like to. Sometimes there is a visa where it's just for short term, but some people are permanent residents, so they are going to be here as long as they want. Usually when you're a permanent resident, you can also become a citizen fairly easily. Getting to that permanent resident place is actually a lot harder than it is to get to the naturalized citizen. Oh, here we go. Melissa piped in, residency is 5 or 10 years. All right. Thank you for the question. That was a really good question. And yeah, it can be renewed. So some people do stay longer. I know people who've been permanent residents for 40, 45, 50 years. Sometimes people just don't want to go through the process to become a citizen, or maybe feel like it's too expensive or difficult, or maybe they don't want to renounce their home citizenship and just would like to live in the US in the time that they'd like to and leave when they'd like to. So when we talk about the foreign-born community, I would like to say that if there are 49.7% of that population that is limited English proficient, that means there are roughly 21 million people in the US whom you can't have a conversation with, and whom if they arrived at your shelter, you wouldn't be able to understand them. So next we're going to talk about culture. First, I am going to ask people to unmute and talk in this section because I think it's necessary for us to discuss something like culture since it's so broad. I want to know what your definition of culture is. And I will call on people if nobody wants to share. I'm willing to be that teacher.
I think that my definition of culture would be based on where the person is from, their background, their history, and just trying to take into account of that. Not necessarily that I have full knowledge of it, but the time that I take to even acknowledge that they have a different input, a different religion, a different background, a different culture than I do. The more time that I take to get to know that and to understand it, the better it's going to be for everyone, the more help we can provide.
Yeah, that's a really good answer. And you mentioned some of those things in there, like people's behaviors, their religion, things like that. Jasmine said in chat, it's how you grow up. It impacts your lived experiences, your views, your values, and all that. That's very, very true. Religious, ethnic, historical influences that shape how people interact with the world. Wow, Stephanie, that's a really good definition. Olivia, culture is the environment in which you live. It includes beliefs, mindsets, and language. Y'all are really on top of this. That's great. Any practice or ideology that shapes a person's views and values. Wow, this is really exciting. You guys know a lot about culture already. That's really cool. That's going to be helpful during this. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about surface culture. Surface culture is a lot of those things that people notice off bat. So one of those things might be food. Some of those things might be your flags, your language, like we speak English in the US, the holidays we have. So in the US, we have a ton of holidays, but I'd say a very American one is like 4th of July, or even Thanksgiving is an American holiday, fashion, and your arts and crafts. So I'd like for you guys to also share with me, when we're talking about surface culture, things like this, what would you see as being American surface culture?
So surface culture, to me, an example would be when I graduated from college, a lot of the African American students wore a little symbol on their graduation gowns, just, you know, for African American culture and stuff like that. I wore one too, and we just wear it around our neck. That's something that could be considered surface culture because it's just a visual representation, you know, in a small way that means a lot to us.
Yeah, definitely. That's a great example. And like you said, it's like a visual thing. So what you're talking about, like having some type of like image on you, it's like a visual thing, but it's also a representative of deeper culture, which we'll get into later, because it has, when you get into it, it has ties to it. There's like particular reasons why like African Americans in the US are like especially proud of like graduating college. I know it's that way in my family. So that's a really good answer. I'm going to look through, see if people have talked about it in chat. Let's see. Does anybody have anything on American service culture? Maybe types of foods we eat here, or holidays we have in particular, maybe some particular type of American fashion? Oh, Faith, that's a good answer. I always use the examples of college culture. I went to Auburn University and War Eagle was a hi, a goodbye, a what's up, have a nice day. That if you said that to anyone outside of Auburn or someone who wasn't an Auburn fan, you wouldn't understand. I think that's a really good answer because I think what you said and also what our other Faith said, I guess we have two Faiths in chat today, is that we have different facets of American culture. So there is this kind of like mainstream idea of what American culture is, but it can be different based on like a group you're a part of. Like African American culture is its own very specific culture that's a part of American culture, but also has like a lot of differences. And then there's also like local city cultures. Like one city might have a different culture than another city. Like when Faith has told me this before, actually, about the whole War Eagle thing, I have no idea what they're talking about. I've never even heard that before. And this is like within Alabama, it's just a city with a different culture. Oh, wow, we have other War Eagles in chat. That's exciting. So that's a really good example. I would also say some things about American culture, like our fashion. I do think a lot of, I would say Crocs are like American fashion culture. Like where else in the world do people wear Crocs? I mean, if you know of any other place, please let me know. I don't know why that's the one definitive thing I think of. I just feel like it's like truly American. Our arts and crafts, our flag for sure. I think the American flag is a huge part of our surface culture. So other than this, let's get into deeper culture. We kind of touched on it a little bit. So deeper culture is often referencing things like your attitudes towards elders, adolescents, work. It could be your attitudes towards death. These are things that don't come up in easy conversations that you're just like having with people throughout your day, or they might not be the obvious things about a culture. Like when you're first visiting a culture, you probably notice the fashion in a different culture, maybe the way the food is. Like, for example, when I went to Japan, like I'm not really noticing the way people think of deeper culture. I'm thinking about like, oh, there's all this like sushi and really good food. Like, oh, the Japanese flag is different. Everybody speaks Japanese there. Like they have all these different festivals and different fashion and different holidays. But it takes a while to get to know the deeper culture. And those things can also be more tied into who a person is. So there are things like just concepts of stuff, like the way you think about things can be different from culture to culture. Even things like time, that's a huge one. The way people perceive time changes from culture to culture. And I'm sure most people have probably experienced that, because if you are in like mainstream American culture and you're used to everybody being on time, taking time very seriously, and you go to a country, say like an island, and you're in this island's culture and they don't necessarily perceive time the way you do. I'll say for my own example, I spent some time in the Dominican Republic when I was younger. And as I got older, I was doing like some different types of work there through my university. And we were hosting an event once. And we were like, okay, this is going to be the event. We're going to spend like an hour talking. We're going to spend like an hour cooking. And then it's going to be over. It's going to be like a 2-hour thing. We wrap it up. Like we had everything planned out. And that's like very much like an American thing to do, is to have everything like very set by time. And then we get there, and number one, it's a rainy day. So even here that slows people down. But in the Dominican Republic, it's like, one, showing up an hour late wasn't considered rude. It was like very normal. The time was just considered like a loose idea of when you should show up. It wasn't really like, this is the time we're starting. And then plus it was raining, the weather was different. So their idea of like when we'd show up was very different. We had people showing up 2 hours late because it was raining. It took us hours to even get started on cooking. People sat around like talking for ages. And none of this was rude in the Dominican Republic, at least in this, I will say it's a rural area in the Dominican Republic. So even in the city, this could be very different. But in this like rural area, none of this was considered rude. But I had a friend with me who's very type A, always on her clock, like always watching her watch. And she's like pacing the entire time because it's driving her insane that we've been so off schedule. And that's the type of thing that you might not notice at first, but it is part of that deeper culture. And while my friend considered it rude and she thought that what we were doing was like a failure, the project we were working on, because like we weren't working on the same schedule they were working on, they didn't perceive it that way at all. This was just like a normal way of interacting and like showing up to events. It was casual. They had their friends there. You were able to talk. It didn't necessarily mean that you weren't succeeding in the things you wanted to do or that you weren't getting done the things that were important to you at the time. It's just like the cultural way of like dealing with time. It's much more relaxed. It's more focused on connection, less focused on work. Somebody mentioned deep culture is ingrained in us. It's the things we might not even see as culture until we are exposed to different cultures. Seeing different norms and different ways of life is when you realize there's so much to learn about individuals. Mary, thank you for sharing that. That's really beautiful. I think that's a great explanation. So other than things like time, there's also roles related to your sex, your age, your class, and family. And when we say sex, in this, we're referring to biological sex, but it can also be things like sexuality, when it's appropriate to have sex, how the age at which it's appropriate to start having sex, or the ways you talk about sex can be very different from culture to culture. Also approaches to courtship, which is how you date, how you start relationships with people, to religion, raising children, and problem solving is even different from culture to culture. And Faith Jackson mentioned, so would it be fair to say that surface culture are visual physical indicators of a person's culture, but deep culture is not something that can be physically seen, held, but more of a concept or ideology? I do think that's fair to say. I do think that's very fair to say. I think that surface culture is often things that are easy to see, and then the deep culture is not, it's more of a concept, more of an ideology. So, you know, it can be a little different, I guess, when you talk about holidays, because I wouldn't necessarily say that all holidays are just things to be seen. But I think that it is still pretty accurate, because even with a holiday, so I'll say with 4th of July, it is very much a visual thing. You're going out, you're seeing people shoot off fireworks. But I will say, I think for a lot of people, it has a deeper representation. I think in the US, it's very tied in with ideas of freedom and individuality, which is a deeper cultural thing. I think that's a really good way to explain it, Faith. Thanks for that. So we also have communication styles. I think sometimes this can be a bit more obvious, but some things you might not think about. So when it comes to communication styles, and speak for your own culture in this, what would you say is, or let's speak for American culture in this. What would you say is a way of communicating we do in America? How about in regards to personal space? How do you think Americans deal with personal space? Or maybe you can speak for yourself. When it comes to personal space, what do you expect? Oh, thank you, Stephanie. We like our physical boundaries. I think that's very true for most people. I think most people in American culture, we have more of a bubble than a lot of other cultures have. I know one of my coworkers was talking about how she was in Latin America, and she was in line at a grocery store, and the guy behind her was like this far away from her back. And it made her feel like this person was like really up in her business, like what was going on with this guy. But in that culture, it was just, they didn't have the same understanding of like, oh, I need to give the person this much space for them to feel comfortable. It was just like a much closer culture in terms of like physical space. Katina said, let's see, I think with me, I like my distance when it comes to personal space. Lauren, did you want to add something?
Yeah, sure. I never realized that as Americans that we like personal space until I had the opportunity to go to India. And I went with a team of people from America. And so it was really interesting to see when we were interacting with people who lived in India, who are from India, that they were standing so close to us. And I would see my team members like take a step back, and then they would take a step forward, and they kind of like danced around the room because they're so used to being so close to each other when they talk. And then we're so used to like, why are you so close to me? And so it was kind of funny, but I never even realized that until I got out of our, American bubble, but thought I would add that.
Thank you for sharing that. That's a really good story. That's really funny, honestly. That can be very, very true. Let's see, Susanna. I feel those who've been more emotionally compromised tend to be more aware no matter what culture. I think that's very true. I think especially when we're talking about human services, which we can get into more, that's a great way to bring it up, is that if people have been through trauma in general, they can just be more aware regardless of their culture. Maybe they just don't want people as close to them. They're more sensitive to touching. So there are always those experiences that might override cultural understandings. I think that's a really good point. Let's see. Estella said, my experience has been that in Latin America, people invite you into their homes the first time they meet you, while in the US, it takes longer. I have also noticed that. I think that's very true in a lot of other countries. It's a lot more like, oh, like we just met, we're talking, like come over to my house, like we can have food, we can drink coffee. And in the US, people don't typically invite a person over the first time they meet them. I think we tend to be a little more hesitant than that. Dana said, but in the South, it's also more culturally accepted to touch and hug others more frequently than I've seen in other areas of the US or in the foreign places I've lived. Yeah, that's a really good point. I think that's very true. Sometimes I recently I went up north, and it always surprises me how different the culture can be in the South in terms of smiling at strangers or saying hi to people or hugging, touching, things like that. Eye contact is a big deal in American culture, but in some other cultures, they can find that disrespectful. That's actually a really good example. There's a person that works at our organization who has told us a story about that, where she's actually from Nigeria. And as a young girl, when she came to America, her teachers would tell her to look at them in the eyes, because when she grew up in Nigeria and with her family, it was considered disrespectful to look people in the eyes. So she would go to school and she wouldn't look at her teachers in the eyes when talking to them. And then because of that, the teachers would say, look at me in the eyes, because they thought that she was being disrespectful. Because in America, you know, if you don't look a person in the eyes, maybe you're being deceitful, maybe it's that you don't care. It's just, we consider it disrespectful, right? A lot of the time. And she would then go home after having her teachers tell her this, and then look her parents in the eyes. And then her mother would get mad at her, because then that was disrespectful, that she was looking her mom in the eyes when she talked to her. So there can be a lot of things like that that can cause issues, especially when you're a young kid trying to like learn the culture. And it's very difficult. And it can cause issues between like the family, and it can cause issues between the culture here. I think that was a really good example, Jasmine. Thanks for bringing that up. All right, so other than communication style, we also have notions of courtesy and manners. We kind of talked about that when it comes to giving people their personal space or inviting people over. Friendship can be viewed very differently from culture to culture. In some cultures, it might take a lot longer to become friends. And in some places, it might be pretty easy. I've been told in the US, we're pretty friendly and people make friends here easy. But I know in places like Japan, it can take a lot longer to build that type of trust. Also, our understanding of cleanliness can be very different from culture to culture, and definitely modesty. I think that's one people notice fairly easy. Some cultures just expect a lot more modesty than others, for you to cover yourself down to your elbows or cover yourself down to your knees, which I don't particularly see as much of a thing in the US. I think there's some people that do, but there's a lot of people that don't. So we're going to do a short little activity here. And you can add this in the chat if you'd like. I think that'd be a really good way to do it. And then I'll ask some people to share. Or if you'd like, you can just take out a piece of paper and a pencil and do these on your own. But for the first thing I'd like you guys to do is write out 5 different words or phrases that describe your own identity, or that you would use to describe your own identity. I'm going to give you guys like 5 minutes to do this. Stephanie also said there are also generational attitudes towards culture, old versus young, and what is acceptable. That's very, very true. That's a good one, Stephanie. Thank you, Melissa. I was actually just typing that out. That was perfect timing. And I just want to say there's no right or wrong answers to this. It's just how you would think of yourself. So if it's stuff that's lighter, that's awesome. If it's stuff that's like maybe a little deeper and personal, that's also great. I'm not going to force you guys to share this. I would love if you want to share, but I know sometimes things like identity can be very personal.
I know I'm probably talking a lot, but is it okay if I share?
No, it totally is. I'm going to give people like 2 more minutes, and then maybe another minute, and then I'm going to call on you. But I actually really love that. You're definitely not sharing too much. Thank you for being so interactive. It means a lot. Okay, let's get started. I'm going to read out a couple things in chat real quick. So Faith in chat said Zillennial, which I believe is a mix of Gen Z and millennial, social worker, Christian, Huntsvillian, which is a person from Huntsville for anybody not familiar, and a thinker. Those are all really cool. Tommy said Christian, female, mom, open-minded and honest. Jasmine said mom, millennial, elder, emo. That's so funny. I am too. Keep that on the low though. Curious and holding on to my New England Yankee status. I love that. Katina said determined, courageous, honest, fun-loving, and confident. Lauren said friend, advocate, overcomer, accepting, compassionate. Bonnie said advocate, mom, optimist, gamer. Me too, girl. Problem solver. Misty said progressive, feminist, introvert, type A, and advocate. Hillary Collins said female, mom, divorcee, Gen X, and brave. Wow, these are really cool. Okay, I'm going to come back to the notes. Faith, do you want to share what you were thinking?
Yeah. So I just put cisgendered woman, advocate for LGBTQ rights, women's rights, a minority, and a student.
That's really cool. Thank you for sharing that. I love that. All right, I'm going to read some more from the group chat. We have overthinker. That's funny. Community outreach, Christian, mom, divorcee. Marley said loud, friend, advocate, empath, emo. Wow, a lot of emo people in the group today. Y'all should meet up. All right. Drew Richards said boy, mom, Michigander, wife, Christian, advocate, proud extrovert. Estella said Mexican internationalist. I love that. Renaissance woman. Wow. Confident and advocate. I love Renaissance woman. I haven't heard that before. I like it. Susanna said self-aware, mother, African-American awareness, honest, and blunt. Jacqueline said Southern, chaotic, friend, visionary, mom, wife, and leader. Mary said religious, lover of all, laugher, determined and passionate. Zanine shared female, Christian, American, hard worker, author, and leader. Vanessa said compassionate, motivated, reliable, devoted, honest, visionary, mom/Mimi, Southern wife. Vivani said visionary. Very true, Vivani. Tommy said so many other words I could come up with. At times in my life, this has been a hard list. That's a really good point, Tommy. I really thank you for sharing that. Thank you for sharing that. All right, so the second part of this activity is that I want you to come up with 3 things that describe your culture. And so this can be as broad as like American culture, or Mexican culture, or Ethiopian culture, but this can also be something like your the culture of your social group or your family or your hometown. Maybe it's the culture of being Southern or Northern or being in Alabama or Michigan. And I'll give you guys like, I think probably took us a couple minutes last time. Let's do 2 minutes for this one. Just like 3 things that describe this. Okay, I'm gonna start sharing things again. So in the chat, we have melanin, resilience, and R&B. That's a good one, true. Also, if you wanna add what culture you're describing, that could be helpful. But also, I kind of like the idea of not knowing. I think it's fun reading through these and trying to guess the culture people are talking about. Faith Jackson said creators, social justice, soulful. Susan said Southern, conservative, family oriented. Jasmine shared fiercely loyal, Caribbean overachievers. Lauren said hospitality, independence, work ethic, achievements. Susanna said 4 separate cultures into 3. We get together for any reason. Music is everything. Presence means all. Pamela said Southern, conservative, and all kinds of music. Susanna also said everything. Faith said diet south, food centered, young professional, education emphasis. I very much think Faith in the chat is talking about Huntsville. So Jasmine said, oh, Puerto Rican American culture here. Okay, Jasmine. Vanessa said Catholic, family, music, and pasta. Marley said hospitality, football, and work ethic. Drew was describing African American Detroit culture. That's really interesting, Drew. Lori Blair said beautiful, energetic, and creative. And Bhavani said extended family, Indian and American food, and education. Dolly shared about Caribbean culture, hospitality, friendship, easygoing. I think they meant loud there, and family oriented. Tommy said hardworking, strong, stubborn. And yes, Dolly did mean loud. Diana said Scottish descent, military raised, proud family. Mary said home cooking, family, dinner, sports events, embodying loyalty, faith, and trust. These are some really good ones. So I'm going to share, since I have been asking all of you guys to and reading out all of your answers. I was describing Ethiopian culture, which is where my mom's from. And I would describe Ethiopian culture as being about pride, about history, and also about coffee, which is not necessarily as deep as the other two. It's more of that surface culture, is that coffee's a really big part of our culture and our social gatherings. Let's see if we have anything else. All right, great. Thank you guys for sharing. Did anybody want to speak out and share via audio? You do not have to. But if you'd like to, cough, cough. Faith, you can. I'm just kidding, Faith. You're good.
Faith Namsha.
Oh no, Faith. I meant Faith Jackson, but Faith Namsha, you definitely can.
Okay, sorry. This is very weird to me to have another Faith on the call. This is kind of unusual. But great name. So yeah, I definitely was describing, I believe, Huntsville culture. I don't know if anyone else has heard the term diet South. This is kind of like the idea that you're in the South, but it's more of like a city culture. So like I've heard Nashville, Atlanta, and I feel like Huntsville is kind of getting towards that diet South type thing. But I think that's the best way I can describe it, because I don't think you could compare like Huntsville and like a rural county in Alabama. Like those are just 2 completely different cultures and things going on. So yeah, that's why I like to say that I'm from the South, but I'm kind of from the diet South.
Thanks for sharing that, Faith. Lauren said coffee is definitely part of my family's culture too, and pie. Faith Jackson said, fun fact, my entire dad's side is in Huntsville. Wow. Faith, where are you at?
Opelika, Alabama.
Oh, okay. Then you have half your family in Huntsville. Wild. All right. I think we're going to move on. So I know we've talked about it a bit, but I want to talk a bit about culture in the United States. I know you guys were expecting probably learning more about cultures from other countries, but I do think an important part of understanding how people interact with our culture, or how to interact with other people from different cultures, is understanding what's part of your own culture. Because I think there are some things we just think of as being like normal, or being like what everybody should do, or like this is just politeness or the right thing to do. And a lot of times it's actually just something we do in our culture that's not as common as we might think. So for culture in the United States, does anybody want to make a guess on like what culture in the United States might be? I know we've talked about it a little bit. I guess you guys are probably tired out from all the different cultural things we talked about. Okay, I'll give you guys this one. Oh, Jasmine said it's more individualistic than other cultures. That's something I think about a lot. I actually really agree with that. I think independence, individualism, self-sufficiency is a huge part of American culture. And I think it's something that we might not even realize all the time, that other countries aren't necessarily like that. A lot of places are more communal and think more about like the family unit or the societal unit. I would say capitalism is a large part of our culture, even though capitalism is everywhere. I do think some things that we do, like our perceptions of time, are often based around like efficiency and like how hard we work and like how much work we can do. Big on the go, competitive, those are really good. Thank you. So in American culture, me and my boss actually shared these with me this morning. We found a website called Cultural Atlas, which is an Australian website. And they talk about big cultures of like, I guess like some of the bigger cultures in Australia that aren't Australian culture. And they had a section on the United States culture, which is really cool to like see from the outside. And one of the things they said is that many Americans greet you by saying, "How are you?" This is usually a form of greeting rather than an actual inquiry about your well-being. The common response is, "I'm good, how are you?" Giving a deeply personal answer can make the situation uncomfortable. So that definitely is something that we do here. And other people might think when we say, "How are you?" we are asking, "No, how are you really? Like, tell me everything you're thinking." When most of the time, some people in the US are happy to like hear about how a person's actually doing. But most of the time you're just saying, "Oh, hey, how are you?" You just want to hear, "Oh, I'm doing good." Or maybe sometimes if you're not doing great, you'll be like, "Oh, you know, life." But that's as deep as it usually goes. Also, I thought this was really interesting. Touching someone of another gender, especially in the workplace, can be misinterpreted as sexual harassment. So this is, I think, something that might be a little more difficult for people in the US to hear. And whether or not you agree with this is a way American culture is perceived in Australia. And some of this can be because our personal space boundaries. So maybe in the US, if it's a American with another American and they are trying to touch someone, it's a more personal thing here, right? Like if your coworker comes up and is rubbing your shoulder, I mean, that's to us like pretty intimate. That's a person like making a move or trying to do something. And I think that in a lot of other cultures that maybe are more casual touch, they might consider that more normal. Somebody said, honestly, I feel like American culture gets confused because so many people try to force their cultures on people. That's an interesting perspective, Mary. I would want to hear more about that. We can talk more about that later if you want. Let's see. This is why I mentioned independence in my answer to the last question. It is more normal for people to move out of their homes at 18, where other cultures they would stay until they are older or get married. I think that's very true. In my family, like my family's Ethiopian, and my mom has always been very confused when other people are like, "Oh, my kid's 18, like I'm ready for them to get out of the house," or like, "Oh, they're 19, I need to like kick them out." That's always like really shocked my mother because she's like, "Why would you kick out your child?" Like it's very confusing in our culture that somebody would push their kid out of the house at 18, but in America it's kind of like, well, they need to be independent. Like this is how we get them going in life. Extremely fast paced, forward thinking, what's next? Yeah, all those are really interesting. So another thing that I think is interesting about American culture is that it's really expected here that you arrange a visit before going to an American's house. So do not arrive unannounced or bring up friends and family unless you ask them beforehand. I do think this is really accurate. I think in a lot of places, people will just come over, especially if you're friends or your family or maybe your neighbors. I actually didn't realize that this was an American cultural thing until I was like probably 18 or 19, because my best friends growing up were from Ecuador, and they also kind of have a culture where you can just like come over, you know, if you know each other, if you live in the neighborhood, people just show up. And like I said, my mom is Ethiopian, so we also kind of have that culture. And for my entire childhood, up until probably 18, I would just like show up at their house whenever. Like I never asked to come over. I was never like, "Hey, like, is it okay for me to come today?" Like I would show up at dinner, I would show up whenever. And now that I'm an adult, I'm like, wow, that would be considered so rude for so many people and so many families. But we both shared that common culture. So for us, it wasn't any type of like disrespect or any type of rudeness. It was just the way we interacted with each other. So are any of these surprising for anybody here to see these things that people think about like US culture? I found them pretty surprising. Lori said, yes, absolutely. Tommy said it did not used to be like that. My mom's family used to go to other families' homes and stay for several days. I do think that's a really good point, Tommy. I think there are a lot of things that have changed in American culture. And all cultures change. That's the way cultures act. You know, you interact with each other. Sometimes cultures influence other cultures. That's just the way like all cultures are. You know, Ethiopian culture has changed a lot. I'm sure Australian culture has changed a lot. It's just part of the world and the way culture interacts with each other. But yeah, I've heard my dad talk a lot about when he was younger, they would just like go over to family members' houses and it wasn't considered a big deal in any way. Yes, child rearing is completely different in the US. That's a very good point. Actually, if you guys are interested in child rearing in other countries, NPR has a really, NPR on their, I think it's npr.org, has a really interesting series on child rearing in other cultures. I think it's called like Goats. And let's see what it's called. I think it's called like Goats and something. I don't know. I'll put that in the chat later in case you guys are interested. But I think it's really fascinating, the idea that, you know, in the US, we have a lot of things that you do with children. Like you go over to like a children's museum, and other cultures, like there's not really like child activities you go to. You're just taking your child along with your day and like whatever you do in your day. So Lori said, yes, we always had to ask before going over to a neighbor's home. A lot of that is due to changes in communication technology. That's a really good point. How are you going to call your family member or your neighbors in the past to let them know you were coming over before phones were as common or popular, before cell phones where it was super easy to call people? All right, so why do we need to understand culture? At AshaKiran, at our organization, we need to understand culture and cultural barriers because that's what we provide to our community. But for your organization, understanding culture, when you have people come into your organization, I know a lot of y'all are at shelters, they might respond differently to the environment there than you'd expect. They might respond differently to the trauma they've been through or the experience they've had than you would necessarily expect. They might not have the language to describe what they've been through or the same understanding of what it means to be a survivor of domestic abuse or sexual assault than you would expect. They might be more hesitant to ask for help or to ask for certain things. I think that gaining cultural humility is also a really rewarding experience. It helps us broaden the way we perceive and understand things. It helps us broaden our own worldview. I know I went into American culture a lot in the past couple months, and that's because I do think it's crucial to understanding other people's cultures, understanding what our own cultures is and why we might have biases from our own culture. Also, somebody said, instead of accepting and acknowledging other cultures, we see a lot of people try to Americanize cultures and people's way of life in some ways. It can be positive, but in some ways it can be negative and can take away from the identity and the base of the culture if it is not forced, if it is forced and not a natural progression. Mary, I think that's a really good point. I think that, you know, part of like the way culture like naturally is that people come in with their own culture a lot of the time. And I'll use my mother for an example. My mother was born in Ethiopia, but she's been in the US now longer than she was even in Ethiopia. And, you know, her culture has naturally, like her ideas around culture and the way she acts has naturally kind of become more Americanized. She jokes about, my mom always said she's like very American, which honestly she is. And that's been like a natural thing that wasn't forced, you know, it's just like, oh, she likes this about the culture. She likes that there is more personal space. She likes that she has more privacy. But then sometimes people will try to force other people to conform to the culture, and that can be really negative. And it can be like traumatizing in a lot of ways to tell a person they can't speak a certain language, or to tell a person they have to act a certain way or not be able to eat their own food anymore. And that sounds really extreme, but like that's happened before in American culture. Someone said it's about compassion in the end. The more you learn, the more you can understand and actually help. That's a really good one. All right, I'm going to move forward a little bit. So we're going to talk about the continuum of cultural competence. I think this is a helpful graph. It can be a little harsh. I don't necessarily agree with everything on here. I think cultural destructiveness is a very harsh term. But the important thing about this graph is that you always want to be moving forward. And I think it's a good way of kind of evaluating maybe where you are in your understanding of cultural competence and your understanding of cultural and seeing where you'd want to move to. So in the first thing we have, doesn't value diversity, doesn't recognize culture at all, maybe sees stuff as just right or wrong, and maybe resist changing their behavior to value diversity more or to be more culturally understanding. So people in the cultural destructiveness might believe in some of the following stereotypes. And these are pretty harsh stereotypes. And obviously I'm sharing them because I'm trying to give an example of like what people might think about other cultures. So some stereotypes are that Jewish people are rich and are good with money, that women are not as good as men at math and science, that people with mental illness are dangerous, and that homeless people or drug abusers are lazy. So these aren't all necessarily cultural things, but they're different ways we perceive other people that can be destructive. So cultural incapacity is no understanding about your own prejudice and believing false and unkind information. So I think an example of that bottom one, we could probably think of a lot of examples, but I've heard so many people, more than you would think, tell me that when people legally come into the US, the government gives them money. Or that the government, somebody told my mom actually, that the government gives immigrants $40,000 to come to the US. And my mom told her this wasn't true. And the woman fought my mom on it, which I think is funny because my mom is an immigrant, knows very well that she did not get any money to come in this country. So that can be an example of things that are false and unkind, or maybe that certain cultures are dumber than other cultures or not as moral. Cultural blindness is when you value diversity only superficially. Maybe you see culture as a choice, not something you're born into. And you might have a desire to learn, but you resist a lot of the important aspects of learning. Cultural pre-competence is valuing diversity, seeing culture as important, wanting to learn, but maybe you lack the resources. I think this is where a lot of us are, able to recognize when culture plays a role. And like I said, none of these are necessarily bad or like you're in the wrong. It's more about like, recognizing where you are and trying to move forward. Cultural competence is seeing a culture part of everything, knowing about other cultures and a willingness to change behavior. And then here they add cultural proficiency as can successfully negotiate a middle ground. So this means if, you understand a person maybe isn't wanting to do something because of the culture they're from, but you're still trying to get them there. It's not about accepting that they're not going to do it or accepting that you're not going to be able to work with them. It's more about figuring out how to work within their culture to get something done. Also valuing diversity and develop resources for further learning for yourself or your organization. Jasmine shared, I've had to explain that Puerto Ricans are Americans way too many times in my life. I can imagine that, Jasmine. A lot of people don't recognize that Puerto Rico is part of America and Puerto Ricans are Americans. Let's see. So I think that's all we're really going to cover with the continuum of cultural competence, the CCC. Like I said, it's not the best chart, but it is helpful. The focus is always to move forward, to always be learning, asking questions. And I think, like Susanna said earlier, just keeping an open mind and an open heart. So next up, we're going to watch a short video on the difference between culture humility and cultural competency. And then Melissa's going to finish up this training with you. Thank you so much for interacting with me and talking with me. This was really nice. I really enjoyed myself. All right, thank you.
I apologize, y'all. I'm having a slight technical difficulty, so give me just a minute.
Hey, Melissa, is this a downloaded or is this a link?
I think it may not be embedded, and for some reason it's giving me a message says it can't play it. So
Oh, okay, got you.
If y'all give me just 1 second, let me see
No
if I can
worries.
pull it up in a different place. maybe y'all can take about 3 minutes to stretch or run to the bathroom really quick because we're about halfway through. So if you need to take a little bit of a break, go on ahead while I'm doing this.
This is your home.
One word to describe cultural humility.
Did you get it, Rebecca?
Oh, did you hear that?
I did hear it. Mhm.
Yeah, I'm here 1 second.
You want to just share your screen? I just stopped sharing mine.
Yeah, if that works, we can do that because it's working on my end.
Okay. Go ahead.
It wasn't letting me, and then I had to just click a button that said enable content.
Go ahead.
Okay, 1 second. Let's see if we can get it to work this time where I can share it. Let me know if you're seeing it, Melissa. Or if you're seeing the PowerPoint. Are you seeing the PowerPoint at all?
No, I don't know what's going on with your screen sharing.
Yeah, gotta love Zoom.
Okay, I've got it on YouTube. Hold on. Okay, can you see this?
I can.
Great.
You might want to go ahead and just mute it and get through the ads because I think you're gonna have to. I think you should be able to skip that one. Oh, that'll skip videos. Oh gosh, Coleman has tornado signs going off, so we need to move the basement. All right. I hope you guys are all okay over there. I mean, we would love for you to still attend, but don't worry about attending if you guys have to be in the basement sheltering, you know. I just hope everything goes okay over there. We got a lot of tornadoes up here too. I totally got it. I'm actually gonna pull up Tornado Watch, make sure they're not coming up here.
So we are recording this, y'all. If you are, we'll send out the recording and we'll be able to give you the last half. So, okay. Thanks for being patient. I hope you got a little tiny break. Let me play this and hopefully it'll work. Rebecca, let me know if you can't hear it or there's any issue.
Okay. You haven't muted, so I can't hear it currently.
Actually, if I had to encapsulate one word to describe cultural humility for me is love, actually. If I had to encapsulate cultural humility, the whole concepts of cultural humility, it doesn't do it justice, but the word that I think of it is essence. Escuchar.
You.
Opening.
Receive. Compassion.
Love.
The principles of cultural humility offer one more framework to contribute to what has got to be our ultimate goal. Yes, our ultimate goal is that there will be a sense of equity, a sense of equality, and a kind of respect that we are driving forward.
cultural humility that is a multi-dimensional concept, and certainly Melanie Turvalon and I conceptualized 3 dimensions.
The first is lifelong learning and critical self-reflection. And in the critical self-reflection, it is the understanding of how each of us, every single one of us, is a complicated, multidimensional human being. Each of us comes with our own histories and stories, our heritage, our point of view. You're looking at me now. I am very fair-skinned. When I was a little girl, my hair was blonde. My eyes are blue. People often tried to call me anything but African American. I have a history. My identity is rooted in that history. My parents gave me the knowledge of my own social identity, and my own experience in life has created that. I get to say who I am.
The second tenet, after self-reflection and ongoing lifelong learning and development, is this notion that we must mitigate the power imbalances, to recognize and mitigate the power imbalances that are inherent often in our clinician patient or clinician client or service provider community dynamics.
And then finally, the piece that I would offer that Jan and I feel people often either don't read or don't like, which is, and the institution has to model these principles as well.
An African-American nurse is caring for a middle-aged Latino woman several hours after the patient had undergone surgery. A Latino physician on a consult service approached the bedside and, noting the moaning patient, commented to the nurse that the patient appeared to be in a great deal of post-operative pain. The nurse summarily dismissed his perception, informing him that she took a course in nursing school in cross-cultural medicine and knew that Hispanic patients overexpressed the pain that they're feeling. The Latino physician had a difficult time influencing the perspective of this nurse, who focused on her self-proclaimed cultural expertise.
It was curious to this Latino physician who, first of all, was Latino, not like all, in his case, not like all Mexican Americans know everything there is to know about Mexican American patients. That wasn't it, but he might have been a resource for that African American nurse in that moment that she didn't feel like she needed again, because she had bought into this notion of competence, of cultural competence.
The distinction between cultural humility and cultural competence was that we were in a process and a relationship that had many other layers to it, and that we were less comfortable with with even the term of competence, in a way that I think people understand well, and that it implies, especially for people who are providers and are trained in academia, that you are then all knowing and all powerful. And we felt like that was not what was happening for us as we were learning from community and understanding in a very practical way how families were coming to the hospital and feeling as if they really were not being heard from their own heritage and history, and how that impacted what they came to the hospital with that we didn't know anything about, hadn't even a clue about. For us, this is part of the humility piece of it, getting to understand that, not trying to humiliate you, not trying to make you feel bad, trying to help us all understand that that life is like this, and to, in a certain sense, be really happy about not knowing.
In April of 1992, in the wake of the Los Angeles riot.
Okay, so I wanted to ask you, let's see, I'm just looking at the chat really quick. Okay, this is all about people having to go to the basement. So And let me turn on my video real quick. So what are your thoughts about that video? Is there anything that stood out to you on that? And you can either unmute yourself or you can give me something in the chat. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, great. Any thoughts? Was it interesting? Did it make you think? Is there anything in particular you liked about it?
Melissa, this is Estela Tirado. I think, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I like the idea of cultural humility because it gives us that vulnerability to know that we don't know what the other person is going through, but we have to acknowledge that we're not coming from the same place. And it adds that human value to it. As of cultural competency, it's just like this is what the culture is, and this is the set of rules, and this is what they're doing it. But you're not coming from a place of understanding and putting yourself, maybe trying to put yourself in their place, because maybe we don't know exactly what their history is, what their roots are coming from. So we can't put ourselves exactly in their place, but we have to have the humility to understand that their story is very different from ours.
That's really great. Exactly. And I think so there's this idea of, instead of saying I know, you're actually saying I don't know, and being comfortable with that, and being willing to be humble enough to say that. And that's very difficult for us, especially as professionals, educated professionals, to say, you know, I don't really know anything about this. And let's see, so Jacqueline said, it did make me think about organizing and planning for cultural humility so that we can all be conscious of cultural differences. So yes, that's really kind of the point of all of this, is to keep this in mind. And as you work through even your work plans and your ideas for what your work is in your organization, how can you integrate this idea into your work? Oh, Hillary says they're all clear in Coleman. Okay, so everybody's coming back to their workstations. Thank you, Hillary. I'm glad y'all are okay. Jenny says institutions need to mirror their servers populations and listen and adapt instead of making people fit into their box. That's awesome. Yeah, so listening, right? So stepping back and asking and listening, adapting, and trying to work with folks is extremely important. And Estella says, put it in your budgets. Yes, perfect. So that may mean training, that may mean, you know, different sorts of cultural resources you make available to people in your organization or in your shelter. And it may mean some budget for language access, which we're going to get to in a minute. So let me share, any other thoughts or ideas? Okay, let me get back to the PowerPoint here. Possibly. Okay, can y'all see that PowerPoint?
I don't see the PowerPoint. I'm just seeing the YouTube video.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry, y'all. Hold on a second.
You're okay.
I'm sharing the wrong screen. I have too many screens. Hold on. Okay. Okay, how about now? We're good? Okay, so just to review, what is cultural humility? So it's this idea that you have a lifelong commitment to self-evaluation and self-critique. And this responsibility belongs to you and also your your institution. The desire to fix power imbalances, because one of the phrases we use is dominant culture, and sometimes we might say dominant language. And so a lot of the things we've talked about already this morning around the culture in the United States are really what is the dominant culture. And when you're part of that dominant culture, or you speak the dominant language, you inherently have more power than somebody who is not from that culture. And so the desire is to recognize and understand what that power imbalance might be and work to fix it or correct it when possible. The other piece I do want to add is this idea of developing partnerships with people and groups who advocate for others or are part of these particular cultures. So in the I don't know place, it's not just saying I don't know. It's actively trying to find an answer to that or an understanding of a certain issue. And the best source and resource is a person who is from that culture. So really actively maintaining and developing that outreach and partnerships. Okay, I'm sorry, y'all. I'm having ongoing technical issues here. Give me 1 second. Okay. So really quick, because AshaKiran's focus is on domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking. And so we want to touch on this because I know also a lot of y'all work with those populations. Some quick statistics about foreign-born communities. So, and this is was really shocking to me when I saw these, but excuse me, the abuse rate among immigrant women is 3 times the national average. So almost 50% of immigrant women will experience some sort of abuse in their lifetimes. The US citizen spouse rate for foreign-born people is 59.5%. So, and the reason that that's significant is because when we talk about power imbalances, right? If you're a United States citizen, that is powerful, right? You have a lot more ability to navigate the community. You have the immigration status, which would keep you from being deported or at risk of other issues. So when there is a US citizen spouse, that person automatically has more power than the other spouse. 65% of these victims reported immigrant-related abuse. So that may go back to this issue of maybe their abuser uses their immigration status against them or as a threat of deportation or something like that. It also may mean that there is abuse related to this idea that they are immigrants or foreign born, and that may mean emotional abuse. It may mean telling them that they are not as valuable as people who are not in their situations. And the other piece within this context is that 72.3% of abusive husbands who could have filed immigration paperwork never file. So if they have residency status or they're a citizen, they could apply for their spouse or their wife to help them get a legal immigration status. And so they may either never file the paperwork or say that they filed the paperwork but not file. And again, this allows them to continue to have power over this person. So there's a number of barriers, and as we know, anybody can have barriers, and some of these cross over with other people who may experience abuse or may need access to your services. One of the main ones that we see, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, is limited English proficiency. And there is a study that and I apologize, I don't have the reference on this slide, but that was done a number of years ago that indicated that when law enforcement identified an immigrant victim's spoken language, in fewer than 50% of the cases were they actually able to even identify the language or tried to identify the language. And in 30% of those cases, they used unqualified interpreters. And we'll talk about in a minute about why that is important. And this is a study of law enforcement, but I think it crosses over into all sorts of other institutions where the effort was not made to identify the language and provide quality language services. So that's a major barrier. No documentation or expired documentation. This goes back to immigrant status. Their visa may have expired, and all of this means that they are vulnerable to deportation and a number of other issues. No official documents for themselves or their children, and this is a very common issue. It may be that they fled a situation, either fleeing their abuser and didn't bring documents with them. They maybe fled their country and didn't bring those documents with them. Or they may never have had those documents in the first place. It's very common in some countries where you don't need that documentation, or where there's not a lot of bureaucracy, that you may have never had documents in the first place. And that includes passport, ID, birth certificates. And one example that I use, just because it's been in the news lately, is Afghanistan. You can imagine, for all those folks that we saw on TV who were fleeing a dangerous situation and they're showing up at the airport. Do you think that at the airport they have brought all their official documents? A lot of folks had issues because they had immigration applications in process but didn't bring that with them. So that affects our ability, unfortunately, in our society and with things like federal funding to provide services to those folks. They may have no health insurance or access to healthcare. This is true for many, many people, not just foreign born. They may have no transportation or driver's license. There's a lot of folks who maybe they lived in rural areas or places with really good public transportation, and they never had to drive in their home country. In Alabama, people who are undocumented can't get a driver's license. So, and they can't get a state issued ID. So that becomes a real problem as well. They may not have any credit or credit history, no money, no means to earn income. And this becomes particularly difficult when you have a culture that is very traditional in terms of gender roles, and maybe a woman stays home with the kids and never has had employment, or may not have been able to get employment because of immigration status or because of language. They don't speak enough English to get certain jobs, etc. And they may not have access to government assistance programs. And this, again, mostly comes back to folks who are undocumented. So some intangible barriers, which may not be so obvious to us, but these are extremely important. One of the things that we see very commonly is a lack of knowledge about medical, legal, and social services. Folks may not understand the laws regarding, and this particularly talks about child abuse, but they may not understand laws about traffic issues or consent or any number of other laws, right, that may have to do with their situation. They may not understand custody issues, the fact that, how to get a divorce, all of those things that may come into play when someone is a victim, and really in any kind of social services setting. For victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, they may not even know that emergency shelters exist or that your organizations exist, how to access them and why. And I'll give a couple of examples. I was dealing at one point, and I didn't mention this, but my background is as a Spanish interpreter and translator. And there was a situation where I was working with a legal services attorney to interpret for a victim of domestic violence. And she was in a PFA hearing. Some of y'all know what that means, but it's protection from abuse. It's essentially an order of protection. And she walked into the courtroom. It was a small courtroom. There was nobody else in there. And, you know, of course, there was the bench in front, and the judge wasn't in there yet. But over on the side was the bailiff. And she said, "Is that the judge?" And in that moment, I already kind of knew that people didn't understand how the court system works. But it was particularly concrete in that sense, because she didn't know what the judge looked like. She didn't understand what the courtroom looked like, that there was going to be a judge up front and the attorneys and the idea of testifying, all of those pieces of the system she didn't understand. And we, for the most part, and if we were born here, have a number of different ways of understanding that system. And so I do want to ask you all a question in terms of the court system. How did you yourself find out about court? How is it that you know and understand what a courtroom looks like? What was the first time that you got exposed to that? Anybody? TV? Yeah, so everybody TV. So Law and Order, right? How many episodes collectively have we all watched of Law and Order? Obsessively, maybe, right? And even though it might not be fully accurate, right, because it's fictional, we at least have that idea that how the courtroom looks, this idea of what a trial is, what jurors are, what pleading guilty means. So you can, if you think about somebody who has never been a part of that kind of system, especially, like I said, people who come from rural issues where those systems may exist, but there really isn't any presence of the government or other systems, there may be a complete lack of knowledge. And so what I always say to people is this idea of stepping back. So stepping back, listening, asking, but stepping back and thinking, okay, how can I explain this in a simpler way where maybe I'm not using really high level terms, where I'm really starting from the beginning and saying, okay, this is what a trial is, or saying, okay, we provide these kinds of social services. This is what counseling is. This is what the shelter looks like. This is where you're going to stay. We have separate rooms, or this is the expectation here. So not just assuming that people understand the terms that you may be using. So I do want to say, besides TV, let's see, Field Trip, Judge Wapner, television. Vanessa, thank you for sharing this. She experienced court when her abuser almost killed me and my son called 911. That's really intense. Judge Mathis, Judge Judy, the news, reading about criminal trials, right? Emily when she was a child. And then Jenny says, privilege is often the absence of barriers that we take for granted, not things you just get, right? So, and that's very true. The other piece that's really important and difficult is a lack of a support system. So one of the things that, and this is true in general, right, of working with folks from all over the place. But there may be less of a support system here if someone is from another country. They may not know anybody here. They may know very few people. They may feel isolated. Again, there are some times when women are confined to the house, and because that's the expectation, and their abuser may not let them out of the house. They may not have the ability to leave. They may have distrust or fear of authorities, and that means anybody in authority. So that may be going to the hospital, it may be coming to your social services agency, obviously police, courts, and a lot of that is because of the fear of deportation, but also just the lack of knowledge. And I do want to flag one thing that happens, particularly in domestic violence situations, when in particular with women, when she decides to leave a relationship. In many cultures, that is seen as a reflection on the family. So anything you do is a reflection on your own family. And it's also maybe for religious reasons, maybe for cultural reasons, that it is not acceptable for a woman to leave her husband. It may be assumed that she's going to do whatever she needs to do to maintain that marriage. And so very often what happens is if she does make that decision to leave, her community and her family may completely disengage from her and judge her and come down on the side of her husband. So she may overnight lose an entire support system that she has had all her life. So any questions or thoughts about barriers? Anything I missed that y'all have seen? Have you seen any of these issues come up in your work? And I do want to, go ahead.
Sorry.
No, you're fine, Faith. Thank you.
When thinking about like the isolation that some of these victims and survivors can feel when going through this process, you know, a lot of times, you know, thinking about the cultural differences and things like that, religion can also play a big part in that too, because for example, I've experienced an individual being excommunicated from their church because of the separation between her and her husband. And it's just really sad that, you know, it can not only just be your family or your community that's like frowned upon, like can be viewed differently, but also the church you go to can also be affected by the separation, or it can affect you by the separation, such as being excommunicated or, you know, banned from the premises. Is really sad.
Yeah, and that is that's true across many religions, right? It is really unfortunate that very often your religious community will shun you as well. I do want to read a couple of comments real quick, going back to the court. And that was Faith. So my first real experience with court was during my first field internship at Tuscaloosa Community Corrections, working with Veterans Court. So yeah, I mean that until you were in your professional life, you weren't able to see it clearly. And Vanessa says, living it taught so much. I was very sheltered into that point. Yeah. So, and you know, I want to keep recognizing that a lot of these barriers, a lot of these situations exist for folks, no matter what culture you're from, right? But they become that much more intense when you are not familiar with the dominant culture, especially when you may not speak the language. So there's this idea that of a number of really basic things that you can do to help assist the foreign-born. And this goes back to some stuff that we've already talked about: self-education, being open to other perspectives. As I mentioned, community partnerships. So, you know, going into some trusted institutions, and for many places that may actually be their religious institution, because that's a lot of maybe their social interaction, and their religious leaders or people within their religious institution may have they may trust those folks, right? So if you can develop partnerships and trust with those people, then you automatically can gain access to an understanding from other people as well. So what that means is being proactive about your outreach and recruitment. So as with any population that you may not be serving in the moment, you really need to build that time and effort and staff time and resources into doing that outreach. The other piece is a language access plan. And if you don't have a language access plan or are not familiar with that idea, we actually do have an entire other training that maybe some of you have participated in before about language access. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that today, but there's a lot more information there that can be shared. And we do have on Wednesday is our last training on that for this year. And that's an online training. So if you haven't seen that and want to join, we welcome you to do that. Let's see. Mary says, in college, I had a friend from Italy. She was in a DV situation, and due to her fear and isolation and not having knowledge of the court system, she decided it was not worth going through with charges. Her fear of the unknown was very influential in her decisions. Yes, that's very common. And that's really interesting to me because a lot of times we assume that people who are from European countries, for instance, may have more of a knowledge and education to be able to navigate those situations. But that's not always true. Or at least that's my assumption there. So some strategies to build trust. And these seem really obvious, but smile, listen, as we've already talked to, and that sometimes requires asking. Display warmth, show respect, and respecting elders, family dynamics, the culture and the ideas that folks are coming to you with, and showing interest in the client. So this may seem obvious for anyone you're working with, but in particular, it's important not to just skip over the showing the interest and going straight to paperwork, for instance. So one thing you can do is check to see if a handshake is appropriate. And again, this may mean asking someone either outside of your encounter with that person or during that encounter. Small talk first. So really making that connection. How is your family? Tell me about your situation. Having some conversation first, because very often, and I use this example of paperwork, right? We are very direct in our culture for the most part. We kind of skip straight to the business. We don't always have a lot of conversation, and within our professional lives, we may be really stretched thin and we may not have a lot of time. But there is a really important piece of this, which is to create space, especially if you know you're dealing with someone who is not from the dominant culture or who doesn't speak much English, that you have to have more time to work with these folks. And there may be a cultural understanding or a cultural expectation that there's going to be more conversation. Note eye contact, note body language, and this doesn't mean to judge that, but just kind of make a note to yourself of what that dynamic looks like. Ask how the person wants to be addressed. For example, it may not be appropriate to use their first name. You may use a title. One of the examples in Southern culture here in Alabama specifically, and now this wasn't true. I grew up in Atlanta where Faith was talking about the South Light or Light South. In Atlanta, I didn't do this, but here in Alabama, very often we might use first names, but the expectation is somebody's going to use Miss or Mr. before that name, right? So to be respectful, you might say Miss Melissa to me, especially a child talking to someone who's older than them. And so that would be an example in our culture of how you are supposed to address somebody. And ask about family and community dynamics. Now, you're not going to phrase it that way, right? You're not going to say, what are your family dynamics? But you may say, who else is involved in this situation? Is there anybody else that you need to talk to before we move forward? Things like that. Okay. So as we've mentioned before, in many cultures, family members are deeply involved in decisions. So there is this idea that, and we're talking maybe even outside of the nuclear family. So parents, siblings, cousins, may be involved in the understanding of what's going on in the family. The other piece that's really important, and this is especially important when somebody doesn't speak as much English, that nodding yes does not mean comprehension has been achieved, right? So you may have somebody who is just constantly nodding their head, and sometimes that's just a deference to authority, or sometimes it's just this acknowledging of that you're hearing what somebody's saying. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you're understanding and processing everything that's happening. And of course, when someone's in a traumatic situation, that's especially amplified, right? So the way to deal with this is to check for understanding, which you may already have a habit of doing, but it's especially important to stop and do that when you're dealing with someone who has limited English or is foreign born. So you're going to encourage your client to ask you questions. So, and one way to phrase this is, instead of saying, do you have any questions? Because in many cultures, questioning somebody that they see as in authority is not done. You may say, what questions do you have for me today? So there's this assumption that I know you're going to have questions. So what are the questions that you have? And really letting somebody know that it's okay for them to ask questions, and saying something like, we really want to make sure you understand and what the steps are. So please let me know if you have questions. So any thoughts or ideas about that? Let me check the chat and see if we have anything. Any other thoughts? Okay, so we are.
I actually have a thought,
Yeah.
Melissa. I want to know what you think about this. I honestly, I know it's always oh, just ask the person, and I tell people to do that too. But even myself, I get nervous I'm going to say something wrong. Or I'm just anxious to ask a specific question and it not make sense or be too personal. You know what I'm saying? When it comes to asking about people's family dynamics, how do you deal with that?
So I just want to say that this entire process requires being uncomfortable and sometimes anxious. So, and as adults and as professionals, we don't like being uncomfortable. But when you put yourself outside of your comfort zone, then you're going to learn more. And so I recognize that, Rebecca, but what you have to do is be willing to move through that and be willing to make mistakes. So you may say something that's not quite right. You may ask a question that you figure out is not appropriate, but how else are you going to figure that out, right? So it's better to kind of push through that and ask anyway than to be comfortable. So that's my challenge on that one. Does that help or make sense?
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Okay. Anything else? Okay. So we're going to talk.
Stella said something in the chat.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Jenny.
I see. Okay. I usually ask back the facts or information just to confirm that the message was delivered. So yeah, so you may just repeat back what was said or ask them to repeat back to you what was said and their understanding of the situation. And sometimes you may find that what they think they understood is different than the actual reality. Jenny says trauma impedes cognitive and communications function too. So on top of a cultural language barrier can add more frustration and confusion. Yes, absolutely. And so that goes back to, again, if you're working with somebody who's experienced trauma, that you really take more time and help folks through the communication piece. And I will say, and we're about to go into language access, that very often when somebody is in a traumatic situation and even if you're bilingual in English and another language, you may have, if you're upset or tired or have you may have difficulty actually pulling the words out in your second language. And I've experienced that. There was a time when I was in Mexico and I was speaking really good Spanish, but I was really sick. And I just couldn't think straight to speak in Spanish. And so even though in most situations I could communicate fine in Spanish, I had to ask the person who I was with, who happened to be bilingual, to speak with me in English, because I just could not get my brain to work in that other language. So yes, that's super important, Jenny. So we have about 15 minutes left, and I just want to spend a little bit of time in on language access, because as we've talked about, it's extremely important. So language access services means services that agencies use to bridge the communication barrier with people who may not speak, understand, read or write fluently in the dominant language, which for us here is English. Language access services can be spoken. So that would mean Spanish, Italian, any other what we might call a foreign language. Signed, so ASL or other sign languages. So there are other countries do and other languages do have different sign languages, and it can be written. So really quick, when we talk about language services, we talk about interpreting and translating. Does anybody know the difference between an interpreter and a translator? Just throw it in the chat real quick if you know the difference. What's an interpreter and what's a translator? Yes, Dolly. Well, you know, because you've had interpreter training. Oral, verbal, translator, written, translate. Awesome. All right. Y'all got it. I'm really proud, because sometimes nobody in the room knows the answer to this question. If you didn't know the answer, that's totally fine. I find that's true with most folks. But the difference is an interpreter is either going to be spoken, it's going to be oral, right? So if you're having an oral conversation with somebody, the person helping you facilitate that process is an interpreter. If you're dealing with a document or any sort of written situation, that person's going to be a translator. So very often, everywhere you go as an interpreter, somebody calls you a translator. That's okay. We just want to back up and from a professional perspective, make sure that we're using the proper term. You may want to jot down this link, and we'll send it to you as well, but lep.gov has a lot of information from the federal government on language access and standards and language access planning. So that might be useful to you as well. So who needs language access? And we've already mentioned this term. It's a limited English proficient individual. And very often, professionally speaking, we use the acronym LEP. We're not usually going to say this to a client, but it may be something that helps you. So you can talk about the LEP or an LEP individual, but this is somebody who doesn't speak English as their primary language, and they may have a limited ability to read, write, speak, or understand. So they may speak it well, but not read or not write. They may be able to understand you, but not reply and feel like they're articulate. That's very common. And you may have had that experience if you've learned another language. It's normal to be able to understand more than you can speak. And this is a super important piece. They may be able to communicate in one setting, but not in another more complicated or stressful situation. So the best thing is to default to offering or just giving someone access to interpreting services. Because just because you can order food at a restaurant or pay your light bill or make an appointment doesn't mean when you start talking about counseling or you start talking about the steps you need to go through for a court process or any other even social services situations. I'll say, for those of you who are in education, special education is extremely difficult to understand even for English speakers. So you don't want to assume that just because they've greeted you in English or had a small conversation with you in English, that they're able to speak English in a more difficult situation. And again, especially if they're dealing with trauma. So what do y'all think the top 5 languages are that are spoken by the limited English proficient population in Alabama? The top 5 besides English. Anyone want to throw an idea in the chat for us? The top 5. All right, Spanish, yes. Chinese, Vietnamese. Those are good. We got another for Vietnamese. Arabic. All right, Jenny's going with the top 4 there. Portuguese, that's a good idea. Anybody else? French and German, yeah. All right, so, and this is, again, I'm sorry, I don't have the reference here, but this is from the Department of Health and Human Services. And this information is actually from 2016, so it may have changed slightly. Spanish, Chinese, Korean, Vietnamese, and Arabic are the top 5. And Korean is very common, especially in Central Alabama and South Alabama. There's a large Korean population in my area. German, French, Gujarati, and Hindi are from India. Tagalog is from the Philippines. Laotian, Russian, Portuguese, Turkish, and Japanese. So you may be thinking, what on earth? I've never even thought that these languages might be spoken in Alabama. But we actually have a very diverse population. So it's important to think about, you're not only going to deal with Spanish, which is the majority, right? But you're going to deal with a lot of other languages. And really quick, I just do want to mention that there are a number of indigenous languages, which I actually think should be towards the top of this list. These languages are from Guatemala and Mexico. So with the Latino population, you may encounter these. We have a lot of Guatemalans, a lot of Southern Mexicans that speak other languages that are not dialects of Spanish. They are essentially, they're indigenous languages, so it'd be equivalent to Cherokee or Navajo, the languages that existed before the Spaniards got here. So some of those are Quiche, Canjobal, Mam in Guatemala, Mixteco, Nahual. There's a number of different ones from Mexico, and each of those countries have at least 60 languages. So it becomes a little complicated. If you are dealing with a client who speaks one of those languages, let us know. We have some resources for that. So it is federal law to provide meaningful language access to your clients if you receive any federal funding. So Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, you may hear us when we're talking about language access refer to Title VI, and that's the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which we relate most of the time to civil rights in terms of race and color, right? But also you can see in here that it says race, color, or national origin, and that you can't deny people participation or benefits or discriminate against people within any program that's receiving federal financial assistance. So that means if as a nonprofit, if you receive federal grants, medical providers that take Medicaid or Medicare, law enforcement, courts, almost every agency in the state of Alabama is required to follow this law. And basically what the courts have said is if you're not providing meaningful language access, you're discriminating on the basis of national origin. So it's important to understand that that is a framework we work within. The other thing is it's just the right thing to do. We want to serve everybody in our community, right? It encourages everybody to access our services, creates a welcoming environment. It empowers victims and clients to tell their own story. And we talked about those power imbalances, right? Language is power. The ability to tell your story is powerful. You can participate in the process if you're able to communicate. In legal situations, it ensures that the legal case is not compromised and that people actually get due process. So the last thing I want to do, and let's see if this video works. Ooh, it looks like this one is going to work. So this is just a really brief video that puts you in the shoes of somebody that is struggling to speak the dominant language.
Excuse me, sir. I'm so sorry. She's been crying nonstop. She has a temperature of 105. I don't know what to do. No, please, just every time I see her, she throws up. Can you just look at her? No, she's burning up. Just what? She's burning up. Feel her head. What is he doing? What
Do you have?
my baby? She's got a temperature of 105. Every time I feed her, she throws up. Please, can you?
Tienes que levar temporal.
She's burning up. Feel her head. Please, just feel her head. Feel her head. Just someone let me in. No, does anyone understand what I'm saying? Please, someone help me.
8% of U.S. citizens speak limited English. For these 25 million Americans, professional interpreters can mean the difference between life and death.
So that's a really powerful video. It kind of gets me every time, but and those statistics that at the end, obviously this is a number of years old, so we have a larger population now. But to close out, any quick thoughts about what they could have done better in this video when we've talked about cultural considerations, we've talked about language. What was the feeling there? How could they have made this feel more logistically simple and more welcoming? Any thoughts?
This video puts a lump in my throat every time. It really gets to me.
Yeah. Put you in the shoes because it switches the dominant language, right?
Yeah.
So they weren't actively listening,
yeah,
right? They weren't listening. They weren't trying to understand. Their facial expressions were really judgmental and frustrated, right? And I will say they could have removed the physical barrier of the desk. They could have taken her aside, right? And I'm sorry. And, you know, and I will say in terms of language access, very simply, they could have either had a bilingual person there, or they could have had a phone line that they just picked up when they immediately noticed that she was speaking another language and connected to an interpreter. So sometimes these tools are very simple tools you can put in place to assist. No warmth, right? Faith, that's true. There was no warmth. They didn't follow any of the suggestions that we gave today. So again, we come back to that cultural humility. Are you open to all? Can you communicate with everyone? The ability to communicate is power. You want to fix those power imbalances. And you want to develop partnerships with language services providers, interpreters, translators, language services companies. These are part of the tools and resources that you need to have, and they're part of your team in serving your clients. So I'm going to skip this part because we're out of time. Does anybody have any questions or thoughts just to close us out? We have 1 minute. So I'm going to stop sharing. Rebecca mentioned our training. There's a link there. Same time on Wednesday. We can send you an email. You should have originally probably gotten an email from us with that. Bhavani says, great presentation. Thank you, Miss Bhavani. Slides, yes, we're going to send you the slides. We're also going to send you a link to the recording and some links to a couple of other resources. Lots of good feedback. Thank you all so much. We're also in the email going to send you an evaluation. So if you don't mind filling that out for us, just let us know how this went, what your thoughts were. We would really appreciate that. And thank you, everyone. Thanks, Faith, for continuing to self-critique and self-evaluate. We really appreciate you taking the time today. And I hope you have a wonderful day. I hope the weather clears up a little bit and we're able to move forward with an awesome week. So thank you so much. Have a good
Bye.
one.
Thank you everyone for participating.